Is there a way I can fast track my critical risk management implementation? The answer to that in some of the works that we've done is yes and no. So there are some elements you could potentially fast track, but you can't shortcut, in my view, to end up with a quality outcome. So I'm going to walk through a scenario of a traditional way and then potentially a way that you can fast track a component of the critical risk management framework. So across the top here in the black is the standard steps that we go through to implement a critical risk management framework. And this doesn't matter if you're doing it for the first time or for the 50th time. It generically follows the same processes. So we do the broad brush risk assessment, which identifies the critical risks. Then for each critical risk, we would then complete a bow tie analysis or some other bespoke risk assessment for that critical risk. We know from the bow tie, it will then produce the critical control or critical controls for that risk. For each critical control, we have a performance standard where we define the required performance of the control, and we'd map out the design of the critical control verification strategies. And then at the end, well, it's not the end, after that, then we go and verify the critical controls performance out in the field or within the systems. And if we were going end to end generically, this might be a 2-year journey. Each stage in of itself liberates work, learnings and system updates that are required, and most organisations go on a staged approach. So one of the common questions, and it's a fair question, is okay, well, if I'm here right now, how can I get to the point where I'm out in the field and not have to wait 2 years? And it's a really good question, and therefore there are some ways, and I'll map out one way we can do this, and that's what represented here, where we can go, represented by this blue line here, where we can go from a broad brush risk assessment, where we know what our critical risks are, to this world of generic critical control verification checklists that we can then use to go out in the field and start executing and performing critical control verifications. So I'll talk a little bit about this. So first of all, we need to have done the broad brush risk assessment to know what are our true critical risks, although if we're brutally honest, potentially you could even move this stage over here, because coming into a business, if it's a standing mining environment, we probably already know 80% of the critical risks, and we could probably even start over here. So what a critical control verification, a generic one, could look like, or some ones that we've done, is, say, for example, we'll take what's the critical risk? So in this scenario, it's, for example, falling from height, and then we will assign it the generic industry level critical controls. So when we're coming into a business, it's not like they're potentially going to come up with a critical control that's wildly or radically different to what's generally in use within the organisation. So we might then go to our library, our Impress library, or whatever the library might be, and we'll pull out, let's say, 4 or 5 generic critical controls, and for each of them, we'll have some generic questions that we'd ask of that control. So in this scenario here, we've got, for example, falling from height. One of the critical controls could be fit for purpose equipment, and then we might have 3 or 4 generic questions about how do we ensure we have fit for purpose equipment. Here we might have, the workers wearing harnesses and they're all attached. Then there could be some verification strategies around that, and so on and so on. So we then have this 1-pager or 2-pager, depending what it looks like, for each critical risk that we can then pick up, assign, and execute. And so we know, for example, they are primarily frontline worker based and activity based. Certainly for a business that hasn't started on this journey, we're just like, well, how can we plug the holes first? Most of the holes will be realised at the area of exposure. So generally in-field observation, interview-based things out in the field, frontline worker focused, the generic questions from a generic critical control list, and my unscientific pass on this is probably about 80%. So 80% of the critical controls will cover 80% of the scenarios. Same with 80% of the generic questions will cover 80% of the critical control failure modes and things like that. So by doing that, we can create these things very quickly and be starting the critical control verification program and process very, very quickly. So there's some pros and cons with doing this, as you would expect. So one, obviously a very big pro is we don't need to wait 2 years to get to that point of doing some verifications. It could be 2 weeks depending on the organisation's capacity. So 2 weeks instead of 2 years, saving lots of time and effort in the short term to get out and check these things. 80% of scenario coverage, so obviously it's not going to cover everything, but there's probably 80% confidence that we're doing these things. We're 80% better off than having nothing in place. And certainly easy to implement, essentially point and shoot. So I don't need to do a lot of training to give someone a checklist, just go out and do this checklist, and it's either yes, no, pass, fail, and then we do some actions as a result of that. So that's the positives. Obviously there's some cons or some negatives to that. It's not going to cover all of the scenarios. And that's why we need to go through this detailed process to really unpack the local context, the business context, all the different scenarios to hone in what are the true critical controls, what are the true scenarios and the highest risk scenarios we want to be dealing with. Generic controls and generic verifications. So not going to be localized to your business unless you do some design work there. Just don't have that time. Or you could put the time in, but that's not how they're designed to do. It doesn't focus on system issues. So like we said, we're focusing on the front line, what's the area of exposure, and that's what the nature of these are. Verification should also, or ideally, focus on the system level areas and the systems that support these critical controls. We want to get that right. So for example, it could be the maintenance system, the maintenance strategies, could be procurement, it could be our training and competency process. So really looking in those areas, because we know if those systems are deficient, they can liberate many pathways or areas of exposure. Can build complacency. So I've seen this. Okay, well, we've done this. We've got it in place. Hey, we're going to be pretty good because we've got these generic things. And strategic work still are required. So if you get to this point, it's not like, hey, I've done this critical risk management framework in 2 weeks instead of 2 years. No, you've just bought yourself some time to de-risk yourself while you need to do this design work. So nothing can, this is what I was saying at the start, in my personal view, nothing can shortcut these steps that you need to do. Yes, there's some libraries that can help make the time go shorter. We don't want to start a bow tie with a blank sheet of paper, but we really need to do the work to what's local to your business to work out those local critical controls, the best critical controls for your business, and therefore well-designed performance standards. So that's another thing which isn't a negative, but the performance standards criteria of performance standard has lots of criteria. This checklist doesn't cover much of that at all. It's a new thing. So still got to do strategic works, and then there'll come a point in time where you then need to work out, when we start to turn these things on, we have to then turn these things off, so we're not confusing the game. And obviously, the sooner we can turn on one of those, so let's say if then I had a falling from height, I would then have specific critical control verification checklists just for fit for purpose equipment. There'll be a separate document, separate verification, separate frequency, go off and do that. So a bit of turning on, turning off. Hopefully that helps. Always interested in other people's opinions. Always interested to learn. Chat to you later. Bye-bye.